Days will be, and the reason why that there are lots of people online is because this will be less interactive today, in that I think we'll just do presentation today, because we will have questions tomorrow, and we've got 2 hours, so we will have plenty of opportunity to ask all the questions tomorrow, but also Dougal List, who's being involved in the work on the region, will be here tomorrow, so that also gives us another reason to hold our questions off till we have more people to answer them. So I will go directly to Margot.
Kia ora. Thank you, Madam Chair. Kia ora koutou to everyone in the room and those online. Lovely to be in front of you talking about Local Water Done Well, our water reform program. So over quite a period of time now, probably the majority of this year, we have been working to get us to this point this week of a key decision about heading out to talk to our community with a consultation on our Local Water Done Well reform. So as Councillor Matthews indicated, today is really just a briefing intended to bring together the various conversations and questions that you have, that we've had together over the last few months, and they've been, some of them have been quite close together, and others there's been quite a gap in between. So today is about bringing it all together, refreshing your memory before we head into Q&A tomorrow, before we head into the committee meeting and decision on Wednesday. So you would have received the paper that came out on Friday, and so really that's the point. As I say, we're not going to talk to the paper specifically, but just some of the key points, and then also these slides, if they're not already available for you in Diligent, they will be by the time you are finished here today. Okay. In terms of, I think it's really just important that we set a bit of a scene around the legislative environment that we're working in. So normally we work under the Local Government Act, and you're very, very familiar with that. In our water reform world, there is a new piece of legislation that was enacted in September, the Water Services Preliminary Arrangements Act. You would think by now I'd get that right. So I'll just refer to that as the Act from now on, you can tell, because I can't get it out. But what's really important here is that this is quite different to the LGA, and in a number of instances, this new Act replaces the LGA. So it does shape how we approach consultation, and it does shape how we think about those key decision points. What we must do is we must consult on the proposed water services delivery model. So that is a requirement. We may consult more than once, but we are under quite significant time constraints, so let's hope we don't. But I think that second last bullet point is really important, and I know that we've talked to you about this before, but again, just bringing all the dots together. The Act requires all councils to submit a water services delivery plan by 3rd of September next year, and we must give effect to that plan. So we do need to take that quite seriously. And to get us from today to that September point, there is quite a lot of work to do, both by ourselves and yourselves. So it's not a light touch undertaking. And again, we've mentioned, we were having that catchphrase, Bill 3 will fix it all, Bill 3, Bill 3. So we're still in that same position. So the third piece of legislation in the Local Water Done Well reforms hasn't been introduced yet. It is still on track for December. We still don't know exactly when, but there's still this week and next. So that we're expecting that to be quite important, because it will set out some of the key requirements that we will need to work to. And that is, as it says on your PowerPoint slides, the environmental and economic regulations, but there's also around the board and around competencies and how the board is appointed. So I know that's quite a key topic for a number of yourselves. So that's what we're hoping Bill 3 will clarify for us, but it is quite likely that we won't be across that in sufficient detail ahead of Wednesday's decision point. So that's the legislative environment that we're working in. The suite of papers that you received at the end of last week, there was an A3 appendix in there that is a summary of the 5 options, the delivery options that are available under the Local Water Done Well reform, and it is a comparison of the key features for each of those 5 options. So these next 2 slides, I'm not going to take you through those line for line, but this is just want to introduce some of the key concepts, and this is a summary of that A3 in your pack of papers. So the 5 options across the top there are the internal business unit, a single council CCO, a multi-council CCO, a mixed council and consumer trust, and a consumer trust. So those are the 5 options that are available to us. What we have identified 6 key features or categories of features that we think are worth reminding you of. What I'll do is I'll take you through the first few quickly, and then I'll hand over to Sarah on my left here to talk to you about the financial orientated features, because I do think those are quite key. So ownership, internal business unit, spot the obvious, it's 100% council owned, okay? Single council CCO, so that is 100% owned by one council. A multi-council CCO is essentially 2 or more. It could be 3, 4, 5, 10. And then mixed council consumer trust, as it says there, and same with a consumer trust. The governance is where it starts to get a little bit different. So internal business unit is as you would know it today. So for example, our transport business unit or our parking services, okay? So it's the same as that. For a sole council CCO, what we're talking about is a board and an independent professional directors. So again, one council making those appointments. In a multi-council environment, there is a need for a shareholding council agreement. So again, we're familiar with that under Wellington Water. Strategy. So the legislation requires a water services strategy to be prepared. If that was an internal business unit, then that would be us preparing that strategy. Under a CCO model, whether it's a sole council or a multi-council, the strategy is still prepared, but the CCO must consult with the council, or councils plural, on that strategy. Okay, so that's where some of the differences start to come in. And the same for the 2 trust models. Again, a strategy is prepared and consulted on. Borrowing and financial and the credit rating, those are the 2 I'm going to hand over to Sarah briefly on just for a moment. But the one bit just for me to touch on is in that top line, the ownership of assets. So to distinguish the 2 CCO models, if we were to establish a CCO, the assets are transferred to the CCO. Okay, that is a key point to note. And under accountability, so the last row before I hand over to Sarah, the reporting requirements that are being introduced are a lot more robust than what we know today. So even if we were to have an internal business unit delivering our water services, the reporting requirements required will be significantly more than what we used to. So already we're starting to shape our thinking that even status quo is significantly different under the new legislation that, and the Bill 3 that's coming in. So there will be a need for greater overheads, there will be a need for greater visibility and greater reporting, regardless of which delivery model that we choose to go with. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Sarah just to step back and just to touch on a couple of key points in the borrowing and the credit rating areas.
Thanks, Margot. Excuse me. You'll recall that we had the LGFA in here in mid-November and presented to us on the offering that they have worked on with the DIA in anticipation of Bill 3 coming out. They had some stated requirements to lend, being independent governance, independent revenue, an investment grade credit rating over time, and that the councils involved with the CCOs that they would lend to would provide financial support via a guarantee or uncalled capital. If we're referring back to the table there that Margot's presented, the internal business unit, the mixed council consumer trust and the consumer trust, none of those options could be funded sorry, the two on the right there, right, can't be funded at all via the LGFA. The internal business unit would remain within our current financial settings that we have to borrow at present, including the 280 debt to revenue ratio that we have on council's balance sheet, which takes us down to the single-owned CCO and the multi-owned CCO. Both of those could negotiate up to 500% debt to revenue. In other words, they would have higher ability to leverage their balance sheet than what we currently have for council. They would, however, need to meet those requirements that the LGFA have set there. And the key point there being, it's not just we will give you this as a thing. You will have to come and negotiate this regardless of whether you're a single-owned or a multi-owned CCO. So that conversation can only really be had once these entities are set up, and it would be the establishment board or similar that would have that conversation with the LGFA in due course. In terms of, so there would be a like-for-like treatment from the LGFA if it was a CCO, multi-owned or single-owned. The second piece that I'll just touch on there is the credit rating. So we've done a reasonable amount of assumptions work beneath what's going on there, and you can find a bit more detail in the A3 page that Marga referred to. But it's key to note that this is probably the area where you'll see the most diversity in the outcomes potentially for council's credit rating. And what I mean by that is Standard & Poor's, who provide us with our credit rating, have a global methodology under which they rate all of the councils in the whole world, or local government equivalents. And so their lens through which they will look at our CCO, whichever form it may take, and our council credit rating will be dependent on that methodology. So it's quite a different framework that's used, as opposed to the LGFA, who are looking at this from a New Zealand Inc. lens and making their balance sheet available as long as those criteria are met. So it's quite important to look at those things through different lenses when we are deciding on whether it's a CCO and whether it's multi-owned and single. So just thought I'll leave it there. That's probably a little bit confusing possibly, but happy to take some questions tomorrow if it's not quite clear.
Thank you. Status quo. The legislation requires us to, when we go out to consult, to include remaining with the existing approach for delivering water services. Remaining with the existing approach is interesting for us. So our existing approach is Wellington Water. We have 4 of our partner councils in Wellington Water have made a commitment to pursue other delivery arrangements. So South Wairarapa have exited and they are pursuing a Wairarapa North model. Hutt, Porirua and Greater Wellington councils have all stated their preference for a regional multi-council CCO. So the reason why we wanted to have this conversation here with you is just to help shape your thinking that when we're talking about the status quo or the existing arrangements, that we're not thinking about Wellington Water, because it will not, in its current form as it is today, it will not exist in the future of local water done well. If we were to use the terminology of the local water done well, our existing arrangements are a blend between a multi-council CCO and an internal business unit. So how we have articulated in the paper, you may have already seen, is that articulating it as an internal business unit contracted out. Okay? And so that's how we should be thinking about status quo in our future water services delivery environment. Okay? Key differentiator there is, whilst Wellington Water is a CCO, they're not an asset-owning CCO, and in our new environment, that's one of the critical differences, okay? So it's not a straight like-for-like comparison, but it is important to understand when we're thinking about the future state, Wellington Water as we know it today won't exist, and we need to think differently about how we articulate status quo. Okay? All right. Good news, I will give you a different voice to listen to now and hand you over to Jenny.
Kia ora koutou. We came to you in our paper in October with a list of requirements and delivery model objectives that we said we were going to use to assess the different options that came to us, and that is what we've done. We've taken those objectives and turned them into criteria and measures that we have then gone through and looked at the options. Now, for Two Waters, we had this requirement that we felt it was an absolute bottom line that a new future model had to be able to access this additional borrowing so that we can meet the challenge of the additional investment that's required. So when we apply that requirement, as Sarah was speaking to before, actually only 2 of those 5 options that we had up there can access the additional LGFA borrowing up to 500%. That's the single CCO, the multi-CCO. So when we went into a detailed analysis, we only looked at those 2 options in the existing arrangements because the Consumer Trust, the Council Consumer Trust, would not be able to access those options. So we looked at those and we considered them, and then we decided that they would not meet our requirements and did not include them in further analysis. Then we did a more detailed analysis looking at those Two Waters options, looking at all of the objectives that we've identified. We also went and had a look at some of the work that other councils had done as their papers came out. In the Wairarapa, for example, I went and had a look at their assessments, and we copied their homework a little bit. We wanted to learn from what they did, and we did add some extra measures looking at some of the thinking that they had to develop our analysis as well. So that's all presented in a detailed appendix in the paper, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but you can see that we've gone through carefully, looking at all of the different objectives and measures, looking at those options, looking at Two Waters, and then I will come on to stormwater on the next slide. We also engaged MAFIC to come and have a look at efficiency gains for us. So one of obviously the key benefits of going with a multi-council CCO is the greater scale might bring you efficiency gains, cost savings that could be passed on to consumers. In the regional report, they did not include any efficiency gains in their modelling, but we felt like that was something that was pretty important to understand that benefit of a multi-council approach. So we engaged MAFIC to come and do that work for us. It's a pretty specialised area, and even expert economists have a little bit of disagreement and judgment about that, so we didn't want to wade into that. We wanted to get some independent experts to come and give you that advice directly. So again, that's attached to the paper, and as you can see in the bottom line there, it just shows that assessment that we've had from MAFIC about the efficiency gains likely to be higher in a larger scale regional CCO. Thank you. And then we also had a look at stormwater, and we looked at stormwater separately because the stormwater network goes far beyond the piped network. When we look at drinking water and wastewater, essentially it's reservoirs, pipes, treatment plants, that's the whole system. But in stormwater, the pipes are only a small part of the whole system. You know, the stormwater system starts when the rain hits the ground, wherever it is that the rain hits the ground, whether that's private land, whether that's a public park, the road. The stormwater system is much broader than the pipes. We also were taking into account the government policy announcement from August that said that for stormwater, councils will retain legal responsibility for stormwater. Even if you pass the assets, transfer the assets to a CCO, the legal responsibility will stay with council. Exactly how those arrangements will work, at the moment, again, we're waiting to see the legislation come through to give us a greater indication of that. But we wanted to acknowledge that that is a different policy environment than for drinking water and for wastewater, and therefore to consider that separately. We had a look at this, and there are advantages to an in-house stormwater delivery model because you can take an integrated approach to that whole system. Council has, for example, a number of regulatory powers through the district plan and various other things to influence the stormwater system, as well as obviously owning the roading network and a great deal of green space in the city. Council has a lot of the stormwater system in its control. And there may be advantages to being able to manage that whole system and take a whole of systems approach. As we move towards the ideal of a water-sensitive city, and there's some work in the paper looking at sponge cities and that kind of approach to managing stormwater in the future. However, there are risks to that approach as well, and the key ones are financial. If you retain stormwater in-house, you will not be able to access the additional up to 500% of borrowing through LGFA. And on balance, our recommendation was that that financial constraint would likely be significant enough to wash out any benefit of being able to manage the network as a whole. So that recommendation was made on looking at that balance of factors. However, our recommendation is that we do consult with the public on this option to retain stormwater within the council ownership so that you would get that integrated approach, but it's not our recommended option.
So, just to summarise where we are at in terms of a recommended option, the officer's advice is that when we take into consideration the ability to access the greater funding for an investment into the network, the ability to access technical resource, so thinking about, and apologies for anyone out there listening if I get this terminology wrong, but the critical water engineers that we so heavily rely on, for the planners, so ability to access that critical resource, the preference of our Tākaihere partners for a coordinated, integrated approach to Three Waters, and also thinking about minimising any impacts back here to WCC should we transfer anything out. So we're needing to minimise those impacts. So packaging that all together, our recommended option is that we pursue a regional Three Waters multi-council CCO. Now, regional is up there in little quotey quotes, just because all the way along this journey we've been talking about regional being a 10-council model. So this is just to clarify that the reason I've framed it like that is in this conversation when I'm talking about regional, I'm talking about, at this stage, Hutt, Porirua, Greater Wellington, ourselves, and potentially Upper Hutt. So Upper Hutt are due to take their decision on Wednesday as well. So that's the revised definition of regional. So still very much regional, but just a different definition to where we started from. Okay, Sarah, can I give over to you?
We weren't going to take questions today. Oh, sorry, Councillor Free. Have you got a question about the detail of the slide or something?
I just want to know again about my answer to the debt situation.
I think that's a question for tomorrow.
Is it?
Yeah.
Me too.
I'm on. Look, we've put... Oh, that's Sarah, not the Sarah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Look, it's fair to say we've moved from a world of previous reform where no worse off was a component or a known, or actually a known unknown item within the legislation as it stood under the previous government. So we had this assumption that we would be made literally no worse off by the transfer of our assets, revenue and debt across to a new water entity. So the same fundamental settings for Wellington City Council remain. We remain an outlier. And the main driver of that is the revenue doesn't quite match the debt that is assumed that we hold. So essentially, to put the revenue across, there will be to a multi-owned CCO, which, as Margot has alluded to, is our preferred option or our recommended option. We're now talking in narrative of something like an equity adjustment or similar, so that we are made whole post the transfer of all of those items off our balance sheet onto the balance sheet of a new water entity. So a few of the factors are listed up there. I won't really list them out in detail. There's a good amount of detail on all of these things in the paper that we've provided and the appendices to that. But we remain mindful, and we keep our eyes on the prize here, and we will staunchly defend Wellington's position that this is, we are the largest council, which means we come with the largest revenue offering. Therefore, we need to be not worse off after the impact of water reform when the next bill lands, and we have the final answers and things like that. So, like it says there, it's an ongoing discussion with the other councils that have confirmed that they are in the tent, and we will report back on the agreed methodology as soon as we can. But we are, working in earnest to make sure that we are no worse off, at the risk of using the previous terminology, after the transfer of the items off our balance sheet. And yeah, a few items there that are being considered in the mix as this conversation evolves.
Okay, water meters. So you may recall during the preparation and consultation for our LTP. So earlier this year, when we were talking and preparing for the LTP, we did ask our community a couple of questions. Now, those questions were predominantly asking around how much should we invest, talking about dollars. Now, there was reference to water meters, but we didn't specifically have a conversation with the community about the level of service change. So, because throughout the briefings you've received, one of them in particular, LGFA, you will hopefully recall the regional report recommended option. Both of those have referred to water meters as likely to be part of an environment going forward. And then, of course, us ourselves have been starting to think about water meters. So both through a funding provision in the LTP, but also engaging with Wellington Water to develop up a regional business case for water meters. So water meters very much is part of our environment. What we are recommending through this paper on Wednesday at committee is that when we do go out to consult, that we are also consulting on water meters and having that conversation at that point, because that way, that will be part of your decision around the final delivery model option, and it'll make sure that our community is fully across what is possible in their environment going forward. So that's why we've included water meters at this time, and we think it just makes for a cleaner engagement and a cleaner potential transfer to a CCO should that be your decision. Consultation itself, so whilst we are still a little way off consultation and thinking about the consultation content and questions, we thought it would be useful just to share with you some of the thinking around consultation. So again, going back to, I think it was the first detail slide, under the Act, the new Water Services Act, it is quite specific on some of the things we must consult on. So that's what I've provided there on the slide. If the regional option is an option to go out to consult with the community on, then we have agreed with the other partner councils that consultation will need to be coordinated and will need to be consistent. That is to help our respective communities understand the water story and understand the pros and cons of a regional approach as opposed to an individual council approach. So There will be a local flavour to consultation. We need to. Each council needs to have its own flavour, but we need to make sure there is enough consistency and commonality because that really will, as we know, you might live in one part of the region and commute and work in another and vice versa. So we need to make sure there is consistency because a single person could be impacted by multi-council jurisdictions. In terms of timeframes, we are anticipating going out to consult 20th of March to 20th of April. The other councils are happy to take our lead on the timeframe for that, and so they will consult there or thereabouts. I think there's one council that might go out 3 days beforehand, something like that, but it really is there or thereabouts, and again, that is intentional. Okay. And the time frame of the March to April consultation period is the same time as the LTP consultation. And again, that is intentional, thinking about our communities and helping them navigate consultation. So whilst they will be separate questions, we are actually asking time and energy and focus from our communities, just the ones. Next steps. So, of course, we have a Q&A session with yourselves tomorrow. So there's I think it's a 2-hour session tomorrow that I'm happy to engage with you and answer all your questions. And then, of course, on Wednesday is the committee meeting with the decision itself. So after that, subject to the decision that you make, we will begin preparing consultation document, including the communication and engagement approach. That potentially will be with other councils, as I've just referred to, should we choose to enter into a multi-council arrangement. And as Sarah was just talking about on the revenue and debt transfer discussion, so we will keep you updated on how those discussions are going. And then a famous Bill 3 we keep referring to, we will talk to you about once that lands and we've had a chance to look at the impacts and the implications. The reality is that they may not be until the new year. As we understand it, the submission time frame is mid-February. Submissions open until mid-February. So if the bill is introduced the second last day of this year, that's pretty much right on end of working year for a lot of people. And so then it's just navigating the usual holiday January period for our officers to come back and do some analysis. If the decision is made to continue in a regional model, then the regional team are looking at pulling together a regional submission. That would not stop us from submitting our own, preparing our own submission. But we would probably be participating in the regional one, subject to your decision. Okay. And I know I said up there he patai, however, Madam Chair, back to you. Thank you.
Yes, I'm aware that we've only used half an hour of the hour time. Should we try taking some? And yeah, okay. So Councillor Free.
So I'm a bit upset because I've only just managed to find the paper, which Tony helped me find. So why are we not consulting on a standalone option in order to have some bargaining power over the yet to be confirmed ability to get some equity out of or swap some equity so that we're no worse off?
Can I perhaps talk to the equity funding aspect of it first, because I think that's the crux of the query. So at the moment, what we have done is we have worked through a huge amount of information to identify the debt that we hold in regards to waters, as has every other council, and the revenue would be contributing, and done a whole lot of analysis on that. What it does show is we would be contributing a much smaller proportion of debt to the new water services entity than we would be providing revenue. So that puts us on an uneven footing right from the get-go. All of that analysis has been done in the wider regional sense. So, you know, all of the councils that were originally in the tent on, you know, as we looked through this, what we need to do is we need to do further work as we've got down to who is left and who's going to be within this regional model. The point around that is that we have good agreement within the region that there is differences here, and in any kind of amalgamation or any process that you go to, it is entirely normal to sit down once you've got the final form of an organisation, to sit down and go, well, actually, what is the equitable debt transfer that you would bring to the equation? So we wouldn't necessarily have landed that. That's just a normal part of amalgamating businesses. What we are doing is we're working on that as expediently as we can, but what councils haven't been able to do is we still don't know whether Upper Hudson, for example. So we're working on that. We know there's a problem. We know that there is a solution to this problem. It's not about bargaining power. We've been talking about what is the problem and what is the solution. And ideally, you know, what we want to do in this consultation process is signal what is our preferred option. The analysis and the work that the team have done has highlighted that the regional solution is by far the best, but acknowledging that there is a big major challenge for us that we need that transfer. If we're to have a standalone CCO, we also need to be comfortable that they would actually have to absorb this amount as well, that whatever it looks like in the future, because our debt to revenue would be out of loop, even if we have a standalone CCO. So it's not as simple as going, actually, we should use this as bargaining power, because the situation arises under any scenario, and how do you set up a new organisation, and we need to still work through that. You may point around.
But I think my point is, if you can't walk away from it because you haven't actually consulted on any other option, then you are in a very weak position. So why would we not consult on the other option so that we have consulted on it, so that at least that...
Beth is going to talk about the consultation options.
So consultation is a little bit quite different for water reform. It's not Local Government Act, so basically you take about everything we normally think about consultation in terms of options and forget it here. So here, the key thing is that we only need to consult on the preferred option, and we have to compare it against our status quo, and we do not need to consult again. As long as you feel that you have a good understanding of people's views, that will be sufficient. It's quite different.
Okay. And the other thing I had to ask is, why is this in public? Why is the paper in public excluded if this is publicly?
It's public.
Find it.
It's because the paper came late, so is at the end it's an additional item. So it's, if you look, it's not public excluded, it is public. Mayor Whānau.
Hello. So AOG is this Friday, and just to provide context to my question, so the last AOG, there was a real strong sense of disbelief in our equity issue following the debt transfer. Can you, in your discussions with other council officers, have you found them to have a better understanding as to why we're in this position? And can we also ensure that the chair of AOG is thoroughly aware of this as well, because just previous meetings, it's very much turned into this is a Wellington City Council problem.
Yeah, so it is well, it is a Wellington City Council problem, and that we have low levels of debt that is attributable to our waters infrastructure. Now, that's for numerous reasons, which Sarah had highlighted on the slide. We manage our debt at a whole of council.
My apologies, Andrea, if I can interrupt. I should have said my question is actually more political. So the behaviour at AOG becomes quite highly political. So what I want to know is, yes, it is our problem, but it's actually quite a legitimate reason, as opposed to we haven't invested enough in our infrastructure.
Correct.
I just want that made very clear to AOG so that we're not put on the back foot in advance of Friday.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think we have had workshops with CFOs, we've had workshops with chief executives to make that very clear. Yeah.
Sorry, just a dumb question. What's AOG?
No, not at all.
Advisory Oversight Group.
It's Councillor Calvert, it's the Advisory Oversight Group, which is the originating 10 councils exploring a Wellington region offering. It's the mayoral level coordination group, and it's chaired by Dame Kerry Prendergast.
Councillor Wineta.
Sorry for covering that last piece of information. Do we know what the preferred option for hut, up hut is at this time?
So,
Is that upper hut?
was it hut or upper hut?
Their paper is public. You can read that one as well. But their preferred option is to be in the regional model, as far as I understand it at this stage. Well, that's the officer advice. Sorry, they haven't gone to vote yet.
Councillor Pannett.
Just want to ask about stormwater because, we've discussed that before and we know it's difficult. So it's two things. One is what seems to be happening is that we transfer our assets like with housing, but then we still have all the liability. And then it sort of seems to be happening now for stormwater. So we lose the control, but we have the liability. Is that?
Want to be clear, we haven't transferred our assets in housing.
We've transferred control over it. Sorry, it's just.
We haven't done that either. We've transferred the tenancies to be run by a charitable organisation.
It just sort of seems to be a bit of a model where we give things away, but we're still ultimately liable.
Councillor, when that government announcement came out, it was unexpected when they announced that the legal responsibility for stormwater would remain with council, and that is why we adapted our advice to address that issue by looking at stormwater directly, because it is therefore a different context, and we wanted you to be able to make your own informed judgment about how you wanted to arrange that alignment between the legal responsibility, the investment plan, and the asset ownership. And the different options in front of you deliver different alignments between those things. The details about exactly what it means for the legal responsibility to remain with us and what governance and other arrangements might be provided to us by the new legislation to manage that interface, we're still waiting for that detail. So, that's, at this point, we've had a government announcement direction without any of the specific detail about how that might work. So we've given you the best advice that we can with the information available to us at this time. Acknowledging the exact issue that you've raised, we've tried to provide advice so that you can navigate that.
Okay, and then, of course, the interface between planning and transport as well, then, so that starts to feel quite complicated.
Indeed, which is why there is an appendix with some information about how we manage stormwater and those challenging interfaces. It is the reason why in Auckland they decided to retain stormwater in-house. So in Auckland, Watercare manages Two Waters, and Healthy Waters is an internal business unit that manages stormwater at Auckland Council. But other councils around the country are looking at a Three Waters model where stormwater does go to this a new entity. And as I say, we expect the legislation will deliver to us a number of tools for managing that interface if we go in that direction.
I'm still struggling with how this is going to be different to Wellington Water. I know about the transfer of assets and the direct customer relationship, but isn't it just a bigger Wellington Water?
Not in my view, no. I think it is quite different because of the legislative environment that we're working in, because of the transfer of assets, the funding, the governance arrangements, the legislation that surrounds it, that particular Bill 3 that's coming in. So I do think it is going to be quite different. Yeah.
I would also note the regulatory environment that they'll be operating in, and the oversight of that will make quite substantial changes to this new entity, and having worked on looking at the electricity environment that is has similar regimes in place around information and price quality disclosures and requirements, it does bring quite a significant change to the organisation and a level of transparency and information provision that is quite different from the current framework that Wellington Water operates in as a CCO. I would also note that there has been some significant changes in Wellington Water with a new chief executive and the changes that they're making to improve the information and the provision of work within the organisation that, Jenny may have a comment on, but, they are making some quite significant changes.
Nothing to add really, other than the CEO is making a lot of effort to just get some of their processes and systems right within the business. That's his key point. So he's doing a restructure at the moment. He's working on a few other things. A lot of what they're going to do in the next 12 months will be governed by the letter of expectation that the Wellington Water Committee approves on Friday. So that's a conversation for them as well.
Councillor Rogers.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could explain a bit more around some of the coordinated messaging you talked about for consultation across multiple councils, because I can understand that there's, I guess, a regional solution, but in my view, there are localised problems.
We've had the whole extent of one workshop together on this, so at a high level, what we're looking to do is to have a consistent narrative around what are the benefits of a regional approach. To some degree, what are some of the disadvantages as well, because we need to be very open and honest about that. We need to talk about investment in its totality, so not just Wellington Council or Porirua City Council. We need to be talking about the region's investment pathway. It's also around, as I say, how we position the benefits, how we articulate what a new world would look like. It's also thinking about for Greater Wellington Regional Council and their role and how the relationships that we've got come into play as well. So, as I say, we've had one workshop. There's another one coming up on Thursday, but it is just trying to acknowledge that legally each council must consult. So rather than going out and creating a lot of work ourselves individually, if we can share the load and have consistency, it will help with a cross-community conversation. That's really what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I guess my question is sort of in the way that we are approving what I imagine is a consultation document of some form. When it comes to us, are we expecting to see that we have got the exact same pages in our consultation document as other councils have in their consultation documents, and sort of, is that before it gets approved by us, is that kind of something they would have the opportunity to have feedback on afterwards?
Excellent questions, Councillor Rogers. Not sure. That's what we need to work through, is what is the best way to work through that? Is it exactly the same, barring a couple of localised questions? Is it more about the intent of the commentary being the same? And at what point do we bring the draft questions and content to the equivalent, yourselves and your peers, for that sign-off process before it gets to that, well, you have to sign it off today, otherwise we don't meet consultation dates. So we just need to work through some of those logistics, the fun stuff in the background. But yes, we do need to think through making sure that you have enough lead-in time so that you can shape that without then making it a rushed decision.
Cool,
yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor Brown.
In terms of the consultation options, I don't see why we need to favour a regional model, so I would strongly prefer that we didn't actually have a preferred model, because I, for one, certainly do not prefer that. But
is that a question?
Yeah. So my question is this. Is that if we want to actually consult on the regional CCO and a Wellington only CCO, can we just consult on those two, or are you saying we need to have another one, which is sort of this weird hybrid thing, which I don't actually understand?
You absolutely can consult on more than the regional model. You have to have the status quo. That's by law, we have to include that. And then you have to have your preferred model, but you can have another one.
to your microphone, councillor.
But can we call preferred A being the regional CCO and a preferred B being the Wellington-centric CCO?
No,
Councillor
because
is asking, can we have multiple
no, you
preferred
can't,
options?
because we need to produce that underlying information, and that needs to be based on one underlying scenario.
So, okay, so if this week I wish to vote in favour of a Wellington-centric CCO, and I get enough councillors to agree with me, then that would be our preferred model? And the other one, the regional one, would not be the preferred model. Is that practical? Yep.
I don't see why not. Margot, Jenny?
It's certainly possible under legislation. The amount that's quite an undertaking to meet the timeframes we've got is what I would observe. Yeah. Exactly. I wasn't planning anything else. No.
Councillor Randall.
Thank you. I'm also interested in the options, but Councillor Brown's already covered a little bit of it. Just to be a little clearer, are we really going to ask 3 questions as part of this thing about the 2 waters, about the stormwater, and then about water meters? Those are going to be structured as 3 separate questions?
Not necessarily, councillor. We haven't got to that point of thinking about how the questions would shape up. If we were to frame up our consultation and the questions for just ourselves, so if WCC were doing this exercise alone, then we could shape those up as we need to. The fewer the questions, the better, in my view, just from our community's point of view and keeping it simple. If the decision that's made on Wednesday is to be part of a regional model, then we need to think about how the question or questions are shaped up in conjunction with our partner councils. So that's what we just, as I say earlier, we've had one workshop on how might we do this together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those will be 3 separate questions. We might bring them together in some way, shape or form.
Okay, so in terms of the options that are put to the public, that's still ultimately a decision that will be brought to council and confirmed by council?
Yes.
Okay. And lastly, in terms of the governance and accountability within the CCO models, how much information can you provide about, for example, if it's in a regional model, what is the voting structure going to be for the governance?
Was that the question that came through in written Q&A? So we're looking at that now, but that's not required for consultation. So we wouldn't be looking to address that. Is that?
Well, I mean, given that that could make a difference in terms of obviously a regional model versus a single council model, the voting arrangements are obviously critical to our understanding of the governance between those 2 models.
Yeah.
A lot of this was going to be determined by Bill 3. Agree? No? That's my view.
But it's a professional board rather than a
negotiations.
Local. Yeah.
And then the further detail will come through. Through as part of Bill 3. So we just don't know at the moment, and we have to consult at this point in time. So.
All right, I've got myself on the list next. So I just wanted to, and I wanted to come back to Councillor Brown's questions, because my understanding, and I'm checking my understanding from the paper, which is that your strong advice is that we do not do a standalone CCO, because while we can achieve balance sheet separation, when it comes to our credit rating, because we are the only shareholding council, that we don't have control over how much that entity can borrow, and therefore the impact on our credit rating. Is that correct?
Yeah. So just to spell that out, Standard & Poor's have indicated, while we have not commissioned a rating evaluation, which is the thing you have to go and buy, they've indicated very clearly that where we don't own more than 50% of the CCO, the impact of the debt would not fully come back to council. So therefore, if this entity, whichever form it takes, can leverage up to 500% debt to revenue, we don't see a full consolidation of that debt and revenue back to our balance sheet, and therefore by inference, the impact of that 500% debt to revenue stays out there. In a scenario where we own more than 50%, i.e. or we hold the full shareholding, S&P have indicated very clearly that they would fully consolidate the debt back to our balance sheet, along with the revenue and the assets. But what that would look like is if this entity has a mandate to be able to leverage up to 500% debt to revenue equivalent, the impact of that would also play out on our balance sheet and therefore in our credit rating. So our debt would look a lot higher than it would if we don't have to fully consolidate all of that debt back onto our balance sheet.
Thank you, and I'll put Councillor Brown back on the list as he was but you're going to have to wait. So I've got one more, which is, I guess, just because it has been referred to but not elaborated on and seeing we're in questions, is anybody willing to summarise why our Takahere partners' preference is for Three Waters together under a regional model?
We met with our partners a couple of weeks ago, and we had a really good and lengthy conversation with them. Where their thinking is at, and it is an enduring desire, so this is not just a local water done well desire, this is an enduring desire and preference, is that our water, its source, how it flows through our communities and where it flows out to, harbour, south coast, is thought about from a layman's terms and my terminology, an end-to-end perspective. So it's not about a certain reservoir, it's not about a certain treatment plant, it's not about a particular stream. It is about the whole network of our water from source to sea. And thinking about what we do upstream, how we manage that, the impacts we have on that and how it flows down and through our network is really important to our partners. That was certainly my takeaway. And that the outcomes that are articulated in Te Mana o Te Wai are the enduring outcomes that our partners will be seeking. So even if Te Mana o Te Wai were to cease to exist as a thing, those outcomes are still valid and true and are the outcomes that our partners would want to see come forward and be present in any new, I'm going to say entity, it's probably the wrong word, whether it's an internal business unit, a sole CCO or a multi-council CCO.
Thank you. Councillor Calvert.
Actually, just following on from that, isn't that though what some of us, other than Takahere partners, others have wanted? Often we've talked about mountains to sea, so the source through to the sea. So it'd be fair to say it's not just one group of partners. Is actually, I'm sure I've heard it from other parts of our communities.
That's quite possible, Councillor. That was simply what was shared in the conversation.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to, just in terms of the relevance of the Castalia peer review report and the Gravel Road report on this. My understanding is it's not relevant, but just trying to understand where it fits in.
So the Castalia report that was circulated to yourselves towards the end of last week, I think what I would say, so there is a report that was commissioned by central government, and it is a report that, whilst it acknowledges there are some improvements that could be made, what it also recognises is that for where each of the councils are at this present time to identify a preferred option for consultation, the modelling and the information that has been completed is sufficient. and that as the decisions are made to strengthen and narrow what the delivery arrangements are, that councils need to look to strengthen the modelling that's done to better understand the information and the investment pathways that are prepared for the final water services delivery plans that need to be submitted in September next year. So whilst there were some weaknesses identified in the Castalia report, I think this goes to Jenny's point earlier around you get to the point where it's now about a preference of methodology and which one a certain economist would use versus another. But certainly the information has been found to be sufficient for the decisions that are required at this point.
Okay. And just one more question. We know this council's got an observer. And one of the things is around how we handle local water done well. So is anything, from what the observer's role here is with the government, is that being factored in any way, or is it kept separate?
Yeah, I think that's probably a question for the observer. Councillor.
Okay.
What I would say in response to that from an officer's viewpoint, and I certainly don't know, and you would have to ask the observer that question. The terms of reference and that was provided from the Minister didn't allude to anything, but subsequently we have seen, of course, the analysis that was provided by DIA to the Minister. Now, that has some very strong assumptions on how we should be looking at our balance sheet. And part of that, I understand what they're saying, but I do disagree because we are managing our debt across numerous assets, and it would be, I would suggest, imprudent to use our full debt capacity to fund all of the waters that we should be when we've got other risks that we need to be monitoring. However, what we're looking at doing and what we're suggesting through this process in this paper is that we do agree with the analysis in the sense we're trying to free up as much debt capacity and borrowing as possible to invest in our waters network. So it's a bit of the analysis we probably don't agree with, but the sentiment behind it and what we're recommending is the rationale why, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So is the observer included? Do they get this documentation, or do we need to send it to them separately?
So we have provided all of the information that the observer has requested. So he will receive all the papers that has been provided. It would be up to him to request those other information. I don't know what he's got and what he hasn't got. But
Okay.
yeah, absolutely, he would be provided all of this information in quite an open and transparent way.
Thank you.
Councillor McNulty.
Just quickly following on from Councillor Matthews' question about Standard & Poor's. This might be to go away tonight and come back to us tomorrow, but what would be the actual cost of borrowing implications? Yes, our credit rating could go down in a go-it-alone situation, but given we're borrowing through LGFA, it would just be good to get an understanding of what the practical outputs are. So that might not be an answer for right now, but just to go away and have some understanding.
Could I just clarify your question? So if we were to, because I don't think it's linear necessarily, Councillor, so if we were to have a one-notch downgrade, what would that look like versus a couple of notch downgrade? Is that the kind of information that you're asking? Because we wouldn't be able to preempt what the downgrade would be, but we can go away and we can see if there's something that we can bring, absolutely.
What's the cost of going? Given LGFA would be still fine with lending to us, but Standard & Poor's
it's how much the hypothetical CCO would hypothetically borrow. It's challenging, I would think, to...
Sarah might have a perspective, but we can look at it and come back as well. We'll turn our minds to it.
Yeah, look, my advice there would be regional versus single-owned, if those were the options that we were looking to take forward. And you could get a rating evaluation commissioned by Standard & Poor's. It's a significantly expensive, it's an expensive exercise. It's not something they do for free, but it would only provide direction of travel. It would not provide a quantitative.
I think the councillor is asking if the council was to go down to say take a 2-notch downgrade, what would be the increase in our cost of debt?
That we can definitely
we can do that. Yeah.
Just note about those questions regarding the Observer that Lindsay's online. So haere mai, Lindsay. Councillor Free.
Just going back to needing to be less than 50% of anything to avoid this debt bizzo. If we were to go into the regional model, we would be by far the biggest partner. Would we actually be under 50%, assuming the huts, both huts and...
These would have to be things that, back to an earlier question that we talked about, the governance and the share of shareholding, or however you want to put that, these would be things we would need to be mindful of when going into that process.
So is it on the value of the assets, or is it on how it's controlled? Nobody knows.
Not yet decided.
The other thing is...
It's on shareholding in terms of a CCO under the Local Government Act. It's on how much shareholding we have in that organisation. So,
So under Wellington Water, it was based on the size of the assets. I think we had roughly half, and 40% maybe.
There's various ways to do that as well. The previous reform anticipated a head count type notion where for every 50,000 people you got a certain share and things like that. So it's not a linear, it would be something that needed to be determined through the setup of the entity.
If this is the difference between being a go alone and being in a thing, it sounds like it's really crucial.
Absolutely.
I think though the point is we are looking at this in an imperfect scenario, and there's a real driver because we need to be able to do a water services delivery plan by 3rd of September, and so every council across the country is working through this, and recognising that Bill 3 isn't even released yet. So we are all working in a very imperfect scenario, and what we can give you is assurance that we're very cognizant of these kind of points that you're raising. We're certainly recognising that, or recommending that the regional approach is the appropriate approach to take. But if those things around debt transfer or the amount of shareholding we had or something else were to come up, we would certainly bring back that advice to you and highlight that to you and take your direction here. So, this is a point in time that we're making this decision around what you've got in front of you. This is an ongoing process, and it will almost certainly change, and we will be bringing these things back to you, including the consultation questions. But we need this direction so we can keep, working through this process and in order to meet the September deadline.
And will we see the consultation document?
Yes, you will. Yes.
But tied into whatever the region decides potentially. Councillor, I'll go Deputy Mayor Foon, as you haven't had any yet.
Yeah. Kia ora, just given that a few things are going to land toward the end of the week, possibly and into next week, is it possible we could have an update email before the end of the year to just kind of give us this is where we're at now?
Our pleasure, Deputy Mayor, yes.
Thank you. And just a couple more questions, sorry. I just wanted to understand, because I haven't had a chance to read the attachments, but can you just give a synopsis on how those efficiencies are made up? And they didn't seem very big to me, but then given the quantum of money, they possibly do turn out to be quite big. So yeah, just a bit more of an overview of those efficiencies.
I'm not sure I can. Yeah.
Kia ora, Deputy Mayor. Yes. So one of the things that they specifically state in the consultant's report from MAFIC is that this is a conservative estimate. They wanted to take a conservative approach. As I said before, there's differing viewpoints amongst economists about how much efficiency one could expect to see in arrangements like this. They felt that the roughly 1.5% to 2% was a conservative estimate. And the other thing to keep in mind is that is annual and cumulative. So it's 2% this year, and then 2% next year, and then 2% the year after that. likely up to a ceiling, at which point you're not going to see further improvements. But you could be looking at to the point of, 15, 18, 20% cumulative over a decade or so. They also specify in the paper that you shouldn't expect to see efficiency gains in the first roughly 3 years, as the entity will take a while to kind of get up and running and start their processes and all of the things that we would expect to drive those cost savings. So yes, it is a conservative estimate. We might get to see more. And once you add it up, it actually is a big number and will be meaningful even at that conservative level.
And then just the same on the Wellington-only CCO model, like will we be able to see a similar, or is the modelling in there on a similar?
They did provide estimates for efficiency gains in a go-alone Wellington-only CCO as well as a metro regional CCO. The estimate was that on our own we would see less efficiency gains because you wouldn't see the gains in scale that you might see. However, there is this expectation that as you go to a CCO with the independence that they can provide much longer term planning. They can provide the stability of a long-term investment plan, and that will allow, for example, better coordination in the investment plan in terms of sequencing over time, but also sequencing across the region so that we're making capital investments in the most efficient way. And also that long-term stability of that investment pathway gives a strong signal to the construction sector for them to gear up and provide greater capacity, and those other things that can also over time allow us to do more investment but also hopefully do it more efficiently.
Councillor Winera.
Thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Am I right to understand, and it is written very explicitly, that LGFA will not fund the water enterprise unless it is guaranteed by Wellington City Council? And that is, so if it's our own water entity, then it must be fully guaranteed by Wellington City Council, and if it's a regional one, then we're going to have to proportionately guarantee whatever debt is assumed on behalf of this area. So, and there's a second part of this question, is that when do we expect the water entity, whether it's a go-it-alone one or a regional one, to actually cut itself loose from the guarantee of the mothership? Do we have an aspiration around no longer guaranteeing this business? Because it would seem to me to be pretty weird if we didn't.
So, in answer to your first question, yes. There's the short answer of that. The second question, modelling suggests between 5 and 8 years, if you're looking at the gravel road modelling, is the inflection point for where it makes sense for this entity to gather its own credit rating, it gets critical mass, and it can go and issue its own debt, and therefore start to divorce itself, for want of a better word, from needing LGFA to be its only lender. Again, with the structuring and the upfront governance arrangements, you would need to allow for this to be transitionally funded or at least initially funded by the LGFA, but you don't want to constrict it to only being able to borrow from the LGFA, and therefore over time, as there's less borrowing from the LGFA and more borrowing in their own name, that will be when we see the unwind of the guarantee arrangements that are provided by the council.
Is it reasonable to assume, and this isn't rhetorical, but is it reasonable to assume that the quicker they can actually put their own revenue arrangements in place, then the quicker it'll be possible for them to actually borrow without our support? Because presumably once they've got their own revenue, they've got their own business, so to speak.
I'll need to think through that one, because the revenue in theory goes straight away. They have those powers. It's about scaling up to a certain level where they have, the right humans within the organisation to be able to issue the debt and move away. So
that. I mean, let's just, I don't know quite exactly when this thing will be established, but presumably on day one, we will provide all of its income. And then gradually, as they introduce metering and user pays and whatnot.
Yes, they'll be using the existing revenue and financing policies, essentially, that the council has got in place. Yeah, and as it works to transition to their own funding and financing, approach, and you can read into that the desire to want to have water meters, things like that. That will start to drive, all of those assumptions. Yeah.
Yes, I had myself next on the list, and I have one question, which is, and I hope we don't find ourselves in this position. However, if circumstances change from what we believe or understand to be the case now, either as a result of government legislation, Bill 3, or as a result of the outcome of negotiations regarding the fairness of the transfer, do we have an opportunity next year, early next year, to change our preferred option if those circumstances change?
Yes, we do. The AOG, the Advisory Oversight Group, when they meet at the end of this week, they are talking about, by that point, Friday, a confirmed group of who's in and who's out councils. So they will be talking about how do we work together, how might someone exit, for whatever reason. So from that perspective, yes, we do. And yes, we can pursue another option. We do not have to consult again, to Beth's earlier point, so long as we believe we have consulted with the community.
So we could have an outcome different from the preferred option if that's what the evidence indicated to us. Okay, great. Thank you. Councillor Rogers.
Just a short one. When a council decides that they no longer want to be in the proposed regional model, do we kick them out of the AOG?
No, there is a lovely morning tea, and no, I don't know that part actually. No, that they are no longer part of the AOG, absolutely, but it's all done very nicely as opposed to kicking anyone out.
Right, yeah, sorry, wrong choice of words. And then my other question, if I may have another one, was just double checking again, there weren't any provisions within the current Preliminary Arrangements Acts that allow us to deliver a WSDP after the due date?
We have to be a little bit careful there, Councillor. So if we do not meet that date, a water commissioner will be appointed. Could be appointed, beg your pardon, not would, could. We could apply for an extension, but the indication and advice we've received is that would have to be on quite exceptional circumstances for that exemption to be accepted. So reading between the lines, our interpretation is we need to do every best endeavour possible to meet the 3rd of September. Yeah.
So a reasonable reason wouldn't be that we have less than 12 months from Bill 3 being delivered?
Can I plead the 5th on that one, Councillor?
Councillor Randall.
Yes, we got into talking about revenue. I just wanted to check, in terms of the right of the entity to obtain revenue once it's established, that they don't do it via a rating mechanism, do they? So that when we're supporting them, we're supporting them probably through a rating cost approach, but we don't have the right to use the rating mechanism to require payment. Is that correct?
The understanding is that it's not a rate, it's a user charge or water charge, so it's not, the security arrangements around it aren't as strong as a rate. How we are supporting them as a council is via the guarantee in terms of we sit behind the entity not for collection powers. They have all of those obligations on their own, so they're their obligations to carry forward. But yes, it's a revenue. It's a water charge. It's not a property rate. So it's like a utilities bill. It's like an electricity bill, etc.
Okay, and
does that answer your question?
Yes, and also, how much is the OAG advice about obtaining revenue connected to the installation of water meters? In other words, if we don't approve water meters, have they also covered off how they're going to obtain revenue?
And so the AOG advice?
Yes. Yeah. In terms, I mean, the AOG has obviously put together this model that includes the revenue, and there was a lot of talk about the requirement for water meters as part of the model. But if we don't have water meters, have they got an alternative approach to obtaining the revenue that they need?
Councillor, can I just confirm that you're talking about, so OAG is the
or talk the regional entity.
The AOG, not the OAG. The AOG.
AOG.
Right.
Sorry,
Okay.
AOG. Sorry,
Okay.
regional model. Under the regional model, if we don't have water meters, have they got an alternative approach to obtain the revenue they require?
So at this stage, the regional model is not guaranteeing water meters. What they are saying is water meters would be an effective use for detecting water leaks in particular. So that's the approach that the regional team have taken. So it's not so much about revenue. It was the LGFA, when they came in and delivered a briefing to us, that talked about alternative revenue and suggested that meters could be considered a way of meeting that requirement. So they're quite different.
And in terms of the powers that the entity would have for charging, we expect to see those coming up in the new legislation. At this point, we have not seen any indication that meters or volumetric charging will be required by the CCOs. Our expectation is that the CCOs would have volumetric charging as one option of how they could charge. What those other options might look like, we don't know yet.
Councillor Wineta.
Oh, I committed the mics and I'm so sorry.
Fail.
All right, team. So acknowledging that a lot of information regarding governance structures will come in Bill 3, have we made any headway of perhaps a little selfishly ensuring more weighted representation for Wellington in any prospective multi-council CCO?
No, because we don't yet have agreement for this council to be part of that, and also because Upper Hutt themselves are yet to make their decision, so we don't have confirmed participation yet to be able to progress onto conversations such as that.
I see. I guess the reason I'm asking, and it's partially a point that Sarah made earlier, is like that would be quite a consideration when choosing to enter such an arrangement. So I was wondering if there were any scope preemptively before entering into a decision to be looking at those sorts of matters. But
no, that for me, I would suggest that would be part of our ongoing planning for establishment, and then also at the right point it's also negotiation with those other councils. So we have done some of the analysis that we've provided you around stewardship objectives. So regardless of which option we go for, we know there are certain governance and governing criteria that are important to you based on conversations and questions that you've given. So we've taken those into consideration, but that's not about having conversations or entering into negotiations with others. Yeah.
All right, that has brought me to the end of the question list that I have. I just want to have a quick check. People are happy to they want to have more questions tomorrow? Yeah. Yes, and okay, and so that's a yes. And also we'll have Dougal there so we can ask questions about the regional process in greater detail. Thank you, team. We didn't prepare. We thought we weren't going to have any questions today, and we ended up having lots. So really appreciate all of those answers. Thank you so much.
I've still got some questions.